What if African countries had nuclear weapons and nukes? Would it bring more power and respect for African leaders? Well, the answer is yes. Africa has 54 countries, but none of their presidents are respected or paid attention to. They are not listened to and are often mistreated, being called to the US or Europe as servants. However, Professor Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba, who is a lawyer and a Pan-Africanist, wishes that sometimes he thinks Africa should have nuclear weapons. If it develops nukies, then before saying anything wrong about Africa, the Western leaders would think twice. So, does it mean Africa is really making nuclear weapons? Let's find out. Professor Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba is a Pan-Africanist, meaning he wants a united Africa with no borders between African countries. This is how Africa existed for thousands of years before European colonial powers came to Africa, enslaved people, and colonized countries. They drew straight lines on Africa's map, making countries and dividing them up among themselves. It was ironic that Europe decided the fate of a continent without even asking them. Today, despite the end of colonialism and slavery, the modern form of them exists. It's neo-colonialism, a system African countries are still struggling to fight with. Whenever an African country rises to a level where it will be fully independent, it is suppressed. We saw this in the case of Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi was ruling and making the land a prosperous country. But he was assassinated, and since then, Libya has been in decline. The reason why Western interference and intervention in Africa is so easy is because of the absence of fear of sovereignty. The Western countries know that they will face no consequences if they openly exploit and interfere. That's where PLO Lumumba gives the concept of an Africa with nuclear weapons. So, what has PLO Lumumba said that has created shockwaves in the Western world? He said that the roots of exploitation in Africa can be traced back to slavery, a practice that diminished in value over time. This evolved into colonization, a significant moment highlighted during the Berlin Conference, where European powers assembled to divide the African continent into spheres of influence. This division occurred as the appeal of colonization waned due to various realities and agitation from the continent, ultimately leading to the regaining of independence. In the words of the esteemed African-American scholar John Henry Clark, Africa's independence was restored by mimicking European governance systems. However, clearly pointed out that no African country could thrive solely based on those systems. Subsequently, a new neo-colonial project emerged, realizing the concept given by Kwame Nkrumah in his book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Today, we find ourselves in a new colonial stage marked by the most cunning actions of European and American powers. Lumumba said that as the G7 convened in Hiroshima, their interference was evident in military training, diplomatic maneuvers, economic infrastructure control through dollarization, and influence in education. This neo-colonial project persists through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and NGOs like UK Aid and USAID, acting as Trojan horses for influencing Africa's systems and infiltrating its institutions. The interference extends to post-colonial institutions like the Commonwealth of Independent Nations, where former French-speaking nations lack true sovereignty. To confront this situation, Africans must recognize the ongoing neo-colonial threats. Ghana's President Kwame Nkrumah's warning in 1963 emphasized the need for unity to resist military, economic, agricultural, and health interference. Approaching the 60th anniversary of this crucial moment, the call for African unity becomes more pressing than ever. Lumumba said that it is our responsibility to truly give meaning to Africa's Agenda 2063, infuse life into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and revive declarations such as the Malabo Declaration, the Maputo Declaration, and the Yamoussoukro Declaration. In simpler terms, Lumumba said that, as Africans, we need to stop operating in isolation. Relying on Rwanda alone or Burundi alone won't suffice. By collaborating through regional bodies and, ultimately, the African Union, we might indeed succeed in overcoming this significant challenge. It's crucial to recognize that it's not just Europe involved. There's a new scramble for Africa, with the Chinese, Turks, Qataris, and others entering the scene. The presence of military bases is a clear warning. Adhere or force may be employed. That's when he said what rattled the Western parliaments. He said that sometimes he genuinely wishes we also had nuclear weapons because that's the language Europe and America comprehend. Lumumba said that the impact of European, American, Russian, and Chinese interference is an ongoing issue, not merely a historical one. Bringing up entities like NGOs is intended to highlight their role in keeping Africans in a perpetual state of dependency. Lumumba said that we are not advocating for isolation. Rather, we stress the need to define how we engage with the world. Lumumba said that as individual countries we are vulnerable, and the world tends to deal with us in that weakened state. For example, the United States engages with Rwanda on matters like secondhand clothing, while individual countries like Burundi, Kenya, and Uganda face their own challenges. However, when we come together as East Africa with a population of 300 million or ECOWAS, we gain strength and become a more formidable force. This is the core of our message. Lumumba said that it is crucial to acknowledge our internal shortcomings as we move forward. Our weakness, as pointed out, stems from a glaring issue in political leadership. To be blunt, many African political leaders can be deemed thieves, and it's time we call them by that name. These individuals are not genuinely concerned about the country's interests. As long as we keep electing such figures into positions of power across Africa, they will remain susceptible to manipulation. So, what Lumumba said Africans should do? Put simply, Lumumba said, it is to make demands. He said that he has penned numerous letters to the chairman here, addressing the role of the African Union in peacemaking. Just last week, he wrote to him about the situation in Sudan, stressing the need for us to address our problems internally. He advocated for a proactive African Union that wasn't summoned by Americans and Saudis, but was united in its purpose. In essence, Lumumba said that we have a responsibility to ourselves, both at the leadership level and within civic society. We must engage positively and consistently voice our concerns without diplomatic conveniences, as diplomacy can soothe us into a false sense of security. Lastly, when foreign powers extend their influence, we must always recall the Trojan War proverb that even when Greeks bear gifts, they do not have our best interests at heart. The sooner Africans recognize external threats and domestic weaknesses, the safer it will be. Lumumba said that if you ask 10 Kenyans, possibly only one knows they are in Kenya. Soon, they will be heading to Burundi. If you inquire about Africa Agenda 2063 to the typical African, you will be fortunate if 2 out of 10 are aware of it. If you ask about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, you will be lucky if 2 out of 10 are aware of it. In simple terms, Africa's situation is unfavorable, and we must be candid in these discussions. If you inquire about the funding of the African Union to its chair, around 60% of the budget likely comes from external sources. It's a reality that whoever finances a project has a significant say in its direction. This is the way of the world. Lumumba said that we need to take charge of our initiatives to garner understanding and respect. As early as 1980, under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa recognized the necessity for a master plan to boost intra-African trade and engagement. Although the Lagos Plan of Action faced challenges, Africa Agenda 2063 essentially revisits that plan. In essence, Africa acknowledges the importance of defining itself and its agenda, and that's a major development. People have started to gain awareness, and they know what is going on in their countries. They know how their countries were kept like servants and exploited for decades, even after their independence. You should know that in 2005, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair assembled 17 individuals for what was then termed the Our Common Interest Report on the African Commission. Blair, who served as the president of the European Union and the G8 at that time, produced the report. Observing the Blair Institute's current operations in Africa, it appears they are implementing precisely what was outlined in that report. This report shows how Europeans did what benefited them the most, coating it in sugar and camouflage to deceive Africa, creating an environment favoring foreign companies and ultimately harming the continent. Some of these engagements are misleading, quieting us with a false sense of security. But should the West be blamed for all the exploitation? Well, partly, it should be. But in general, the West is not to blame because you can never blame a monster for killing a lion who separated from its pride of lions. If these lions were united, the master could have never approached and benefited. That's why Lumumba stressed the need to decolonize all learning. There's a saying that the happiness of the slave is the comfort of the slave owner. There's a saying that the happiness of the slave is the comfort of the slave owner. If Africa doesn't recognize this, we will never realize our potential. The saying goes, if you behave like grass, the elephants will eat you. In many instances, we in the African continent act like grass, fit for consumption. Moving forward in strategic engagements like this, it's crucial for the continent of Africa to recognize that there's a new scramble, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Lumumba said that Russian, American, Chinese, French, and Turkish officials were all present in the continent within a 2-week period. What were they seeking? Their best interests lie in engaging smaller countries and avoiding associations like the East African Community, African Union, and ECOWAS. Because when united, these larger entities are not easily manipulated. PLO Lumumba highlighted that the previous year, African heads of state and government were deliberately summoned to Washington, D.C. Following the president's address and photo session, Africa was granted $60 billion for 54 countries. Subsequently, the American president initiated bilateral agreements with Burundi, Lesotho, and Kenya. In terms of semantics, Lumumba underscored the importance of considering the language used to define interference. Many times we find ourselves restricted by Portuguese, French, English, or other colonial languages employed in our engagements. History has repeatedly shown that interference, even with noble intentions initially, can take a turn for the worse once the proverbial Trojan horse is inside, as seen in the case of Libya. PLO Lumumba underscored the significance of recognizing the current situations in the Central African Republic and Somalia, emphasizing that despite the initial good intentions, the results speak for themselves. In his words, he highlighted the principle that a tree should be judged by its fruits, illustrating that a mango claiming to be an orange is still fundamentally a mango. Lumumba also spotlighted the British strategy of dividing and ruling, fostering ethnic animosity in regions like the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda and various kingdoms in Kenya, including the Maasai. But what should Africans do when Western countries interfere? Foreign interference is not always open. Most of the time it's subtle, but it creates a chain reaction due to the nature of the system. Lumumba pointed out that Africa lacked meaningful participation in institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and the IMF, which were crafted in 1944 by British and American economists post-World War II for the reparation of Europe through the Marshall Plan. Lumumba expressed concern about Africa's dependency on these institutions, highlighting issues with IMF prescriptions being one-size-fits-all, as evidenced by the unfavorable outcomes of structural adjustments in the 1980s. He underscored that Africa had minimal involvement in shaping this economic architecture, and this put Africa way behind. Lumumba highlighted that the World Trade Organization, initially part of the United Nations in 1945, is designed in a way that does not favor Africa. The prevailing notion is that Africa continues to be a producer of primary goods while consuming items with added value. Africa has undertaken various initiatives in response to this, including early ones like the African, Pacific, Caribbean, Pacific, the Lomé Convention, and the Continued Declaration, influenced externally. Following the failure of the Lomé Convention, Africa pursued its own approach, leading to the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980. Despite recognizing substantial trade engagement by Europe, North America, Asia, and Latin America, Africa's intracontinental trade remains at only 15%. While the Lagos Plan of Action fell short of its goals, Africa consistently sees a united government as a solution. In a speech on May 24, 1963, Kwame Nkrumah envisioned that having one government, one army, and one foreign policy would make Africa stronger and more resilient in a hostile world. Despite skepticism initially, Nkrumah's vision received validation in 2013 with Africa Agenda 2063. Lumumba said that despite the initial expectation of inaugurating the first East African president by 2010, this did not come to pass. Presently, there is an ongoing effort to draft a constitution for the East African Confederates, recognizing the necessity of a robust market to counter foreign interference effectively. This market includes Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and now the Democratic Republic of Congo, with considerations from Somalis and Ethiopians. Moving beyond regional endeavors like the East African Community, Lumumba highlighted the African Union's significance as outlined in Africa Agenda 2063. The 7 aspirations within this agenda are strategically crafted to serve as a defense against foreign interference. Lumumba pointed out that, despite the concept of sovereignty, the reality is that smaller nations face inequality in negotiations. Meetings like the G7 and G20 exclude smaller economies, underscoring the necessity of unity for African nations in negotiations. But what did Lumumba say about the African history that the West has tempered? Reflecting on his educational experience, Lumumba noted the critical role of history, particularly the history of Pan-African movements, in the curriculum. He expressed concern about the diminishing emphasis on history in many African countries, leading to a lack of awareness about the continent's past. That's what the West wants, because a nation can only be injected with harmful culture and history when it forgets its own culture and history. Lumumba called for a reassessment of the curriculum in higher learning institutions to reintroduce Pan-Africanism and instill a sense of identity and purpose among the youth. He emphasized the deliberate indoctrination of the younger generation in the ideals of Pan-Africanism as crucial for initiatives like Africa Agenda 2063 to gain momentum. So, what would it look like if an African country developed a nuclear weapon? Well, history provides us with an example where the first ever African country developed nuclear weapons. It was South Africa. It initiated its exploration for nuclear weapons in 1948, when the South African Atomic Energy Corporation was tasked with overseeing uranium mining and industrial trade. By 1957, South Africa entered into a 50-year collaboration with the United States through the U.S.-sanctioned Atoms for Peace program. This collaboration allowed South Africa to acquire a single nuclear research reactor and a supply of highly enriched uranium fuel situated in Pelindaba. From the 1960s to the 1990s, South Africa engaged in research on weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, during the era of apartheid. The nuclear weapons doctrine of South Africa was strategically designed for political leverage rather than actual battlefield deployment. That's something Africa needs today, a bargaining chip or leverage. The objective was to persuade the United States to intervene in regional conflicts involving South Africa and the Soviet Union or its proxies. By the late 1980s, 6 nuclear weapons were secretly assembled to establish a minimum credible deterrence. The South African Atomic Energy Board identified a test site in the Kalahari Desert at the Vastrap Weapons Range north of Upington, completing 2 test shafts in 1976 and 1977. A high-security weapons research and development facility was established at Pelindaba in 1977. Although a gun-type device was produced in mid-1977, a planned cold test in August 1977 was canceled after Soviet intelligence detected test preparations and alerted the United States. Western nations exerted pressure on South Africa not to proceed with the test, expressing concerns about diplomatic relations and contracts, especially with France regarding the Coburg nuclear power reactors. The exposed test site was closed in 1993, with one shaft temporarily reopened in 1988 during negotiations to end the war with Angola and Cuba as a strategic maneuver. Anticipating the transition to a majority-elected African National Congress-led government in the 1990s, South Africa took a historic step by voluntarily dismantling all its nuclear weapons. It became the first nation globally to disarm its self-developed nuclear arsenal. Since then, South Africa has been a signatory to various arms control treaties, including the Biological Weapons Convention in 1975 and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1991. In February 2019, South Africa ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, solidifying its commitment as the first nation to possess, disarm, and sign the treaty. But why did South Africa deliberately give up its nuclear weapons? To this, there are various arguments. Some argue that Western powers, particularly the United States and its allies, exerted imperialistic pressure on South Africa to abandon its nuclear weapons program, viewing this pressure as an attempt to maintain dominance and control over global nuclear capabilities. Another perspective suggests that the decision to relinquish nuclear weapons was influenced by neo-colonial interests, with Western powers seeking to ensure that post-apartheid South Africa remained subservient to their economic and political interests, and giving up nuclear weapons became a condition for alignment. The economic sanctions imposed on South Africa due to apartheid were a coercive tool employed by Western nations, framing the decision to abandon nuclear weapons as a strategic move to alleviate economic pressure rather than a genuine commitment to non-proliferation. Others argue that the West, particularly the United States, aimed to maintain its global hegemony in nuclear affairs. By pressuring South Africa to relinquish its nuclear weapons, Western powers could be accused of attempting to control the narrative on nuclear capabilities. On the other hand, there is a perspective that South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons of its own will. South African forces were troubled by the perceived risk of a domino effect favoring communism, particularly evident in southern Africa. Cuban forces in Angola supported Marxist-Leninist revolutionary groups against rivals backed by South African forces, posing a threat to Namibia. Therefore, in 1988, South Africa engaged in the tripartite accord with Cuba and Angola, resulting in the withdrawal of both South African and Cuban troops from Angola and the achievement of independence for Namibia. The proactive decision to dismantle nuclear weapons was seen as a significant move toward regional stability and peace, as well as a way to restore South Africa's credibility in regional and international politics. FW. De Klerk acknowledged the presence of nuclear weapons as a problem and shared information about them with the United States to facilitate their removal. South Africa officially terminated its nuclear weapons program in 1989. All 7 bombs, 6 completed and 1 under construction, were dismantled. South Africa joined the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons when the South African ambassador to the United States, Harry Schwartz, signed the treaty in 1991. What do you think? Should African countries develop nuclear weapons? Will they give them more power, respect, and bargaining leverage? In the comment section right below, let us know your thoughts on whether Kim Jong-un of North Korea would be feared and respected if he had no nuclear weapons. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.